What we're getting into is Plato's theory about what reality is. So what is reality fundamentally? And Plato, like Aristotle, has a very sophisticated theory on this, and we're not going to be able to get into all of its sophistication or anywhere near its sophistication. But I want to give you a basic sense, and this theory is Plato's theory is called the theory of forms generally. When we talk about a theory here, we shouldn't get too caught up in that word and what we normally mean by it in contemporary English, where we're usually, if we think about a theory, someone can list, well, here's what this theory says is true, this, that, and the other. We could write it down in a book and so on. Plato doesn't have that, right? He doesn't have a theory of forms in the sense of, oh, here's my treatise, the theory of forms, and it tells you everything you need to know about reality and what the fundamental nature of reality is. I take it Plato, what he's doing can be called a theory of forms, where we take theory in like the original meaning of the term, where the Greek word theoria, which means, is a term we translate as contemplating, so understanding and seeing. So theory in that sense of a way of seeing reality, contemplating it, a way of looking at it. Yeah, that's what the theory of forms is. It's a theory in that sense, a way of seeing reality and understanding reality. And so in this mini lecture, what I want to do is give you a basic introduction to Plato's theory of forms, and then we'll unpack this theory in a deeper way in the next couple of weeks. I'll start where I left off in the previous mini lecture, where we were asking this question, what must reality be like if experts can know it? And we said, well, reality has got to have common characteristics and properties, otherwise expert knowledge would be impossible. Individual instances have to share those common characteristics and properties. Reality has to be consistent and coherent. It has to be intelligible. It must include reasons why, and it must be such that a person with expert knowledge could define it. Like real things have to be that way. So that's what reality has to be like if expert knowledge, at least as we've been conceptualizing it, is possible. So Plato's theory of forms can be seen as an attempt to describe what reality is, or what it's like, given the assumption that expert knowledge is possible and has the characteristics, meaning expert knowledge has the characteristics that we think it does. Reality must have common characteristics and properties. To get how Plato wants to talk about this, let's just call those common characteristics and properties that reality has, let's call those forms, using that technical term. And that's what we're using that term to mean. We mean common characteristics of things. That's what a form is. And all this is a terminological stipulation, right? This isn't really saying anything new. This is just saying, hey, in order to try to think about this and see it and understand it clearly and consistently, let's use some technical terms. Let's use forms to talk about the common characteristics. That's what we'll, instead of having to say a awkward phrase like common characteristics or properties, we'll just use one word, form. So reality must have forms, right? Forms must be part of reality. Individual instances must share in these common characteristics or properties, which means that individual things we perceive around us and individual things in general have to share these common characteristics and properties if expert knowledge is going to be possible. So we can use this term sharing. We can talk about them sharing in the forms, right? So I share in the form human being because I'm human, all right? Or I'm human because I share in the form human being is probably the more correct way to say it. But we can use share in or maybe participate in. Again, we're just trying to get some terminology going here. We're not saying anything new. We're just trying to put like some terms to what we're already recognizing. So let's use this term share in or participate in, either one of those. Reality must be consistent and coherent. That means that the forms have to be consistently and coherently related to one another, because when we say reality must be consistent and coherent, what we basically mean there is those common properties and the way they're in things and things share in them, all that has to be consistent and coherent. So with forms. Reality must be intelligible, it has to be understandable. That means the forms have to be understandable. Because if we're going to say reality is basically these different common characteristics are all related to one another, well, they've got to be understandable, or else there's going to be no way to understand reality. Reality must include reasons why, and these forms are the most basic reasons why things are the way they are. Again, I gave the example of this triangle on the screen. Why is that triangle? Again, if I was presenting this in a classroom with a PowerPoint, that triangle would be larger than my finger. Why is it larger than my finger? Because it has this property or characteristic largeness, which, if we just want to use our technical terminology we just developed, we'd say, well, because it participates in the form largeness. That's the most basic reason why that triangle is large. Or why that triangle is a shape. The most basic reason why the triangle is a shape is because it participates in the form shape, which is to say, because it has that property or characteristic of shape. That's why the triangle is a shape, because it's sharing in that common feature or characteristic. Real things, also if expert knowledge is going to be possible, real things must be such that a person with expert knowledge can define them. Forms are such that we can define them. Right? Forms have to be such that we can define them if expert knowledge is going to be possible. We have to be able to define these common characteristics and how they all relate to each other. Sure, it's okay for there to be more than one true definition of the same form. Socrates in the Dialogues doesn't have any problem with that. Socrates, for example, offers two true definitions of shape in the Meno. Shape is the only thing which always follows color, and also shape is the limit of a solid. So both those are true ways of identifying what a shape is. Even though there's only one form, shape, that we're talking about here, we've got two true definitions, and there could probably be more. Of course, there's plenty of false definitions too, so it doesn't mean every definition you give is true. It's actually hard to find a true definition of something, like even a true definition of a shape is relatively hard, and for something more difficult like piety, it's going to be even more difficult to find a true definition. But there's probably more than one definition of piety, just like there's more than one definition of shape that could be true. Okay, so let's move from that basic, how we're going from here's what we already assume reality is like, to now let's just put some terms to that, and now we're into Plato's theory of forms. So what is a theory of forms exactly doing, right? Like, what is it trying to explain? So let's consider a concrete example. I usually do this in a classroom, so I'm talking about chalk. So what's the nature of chalk? Chemistry, that science, has an answer to this question. Chalk is calcium carbonate. So chemistry, that science, answers that question, what is the nature of chalk? And perhaps actually you could answer that question in a few different sciences and from a few different perspectives. That's fine too. But what's the nature of chalk isn't exactly as such a philosophical question. It's a question for chemistry, say. But what is a philosophical question, and this is where we need a philosophical theory like the theory of forms, is the question, why is this entity a piece of chalk, right? So if I'm holding up a piece of chalk, which I would be if we were in the classroom, I'm not right now, but say I'm holding a piece of chalk, and I go, why is this entity a piece of chalk? Right? Why is this being a piece of chalk? Now, why do we call it a piece of chalk? That's not the question I'm asking. I'm not asking why we call it chalk. I'm asking, why is it chalk, right? Why is it calcium carbonate? Why is this chalk? That's a philosophical question, right? Because that's not what science is answering, right? What chemistry is answering. It's telling you what chalk is, but it's not saying why this particular thing I'm holding up is chalk or calcium carbonate, right? This is rather a philosophical question. It's a question one could give different answers to. Kind of if we want to oversimplify a bit and get two basic camps here, there's two main answers that philosophers have given to this. So the Platonic, the one we're looking at with theory of forms, or Aristotelian, or in modern philosophy, the rationalists and German idealists, they give the answer that this is a piece of chalk because it has the nature of chalk, or using Platonic terminology, you could say it participates in the form chalk. And most of these views would be fine with this terminology of has the nature of chalk. Plato would be fine with that. Aristotle would be. Generally, the rationalists and German idealists would be as well. But Plato would be probably the only one who's fine with using this participates in the form chalk terminology. The other systems don't like that terminology as much. But again, that's kind of a terminological issue. There are substantive disagreements behind that, but for our purposes, it's not that important. Now, within this first option, you would get kind of different ways of understanding this. So in certain rationalist or German idealist schools of thought, especially certain kinds of German idealism perhaps, they might say that this entity isn't even an entity outside of human consciousness, right? A shared human consciousness, this wouldn't even be a real thing, right? So there's no like mind independent or independent of all human experience. There's no such thing as chalk, right? Where in Plato and Aristotle there would be, right? If there were no humans, there'd still be chalk. So right, that's why this is definitely a philosophical question to ask, why is this thing, that if I were in a classroom I'd be holding up, why is this a piece of chalk? There's really different answers people could give to this, right? You could say, well, it's a piece of chalk because that's how human consciousness interprets it as, or you could say it's a piece of chalk because it's an individual instance of chalkness or the nature of chalk. In both cases, though, you'd still be saying it's a piece of chalk because it has that nature of chalk, whether that nature is just something it has because of what it is, or whether that nature is something it has because human consciousness is giving it that nature, like it might be in certain versions of German idealism or in Kant. That's, I think, less of a disagreement than you would get with the second, like, nominalist answer, right? So again, the Platonic, Aristotelian, rationalist, or German idealists, what they all agree on, even though they differ on a lot of these other details, what they all agree on is that the nature of chalk is why this, having the nature of chalk is why this entity is a piece of chalk. Now, nominalists, which is a school of thought that develops in the Middle Ages, and especially the late Middle Ages, in this nominalist answer, which is against Plato and the rest of these views, is to say that it's chalk because we as humans call it chalk, or we can conceptualize it as chalk. So it's not really chalk, like it's something, but it's not chalk, but we think of it that way and we conceptualize it that way. And so we just give this word chalk to it. The nominalist answer has like a ton of problems with it, in my view at least. And so, for example, again, I'm not asking why do we call this a piece of chalk. I'm saying, why is it chalk, right? So in a sense, like, nominalism seems like it's not even answering the question I'm answering, right? Because I'm not trying to get at why we call it chalk. Sure, we call it chalk because we came up with this word chalk that we apply to it. That's fine. But that's not answering why it is chalk. Or why do we conceptualize it as chalk? Again, I'm not asking that. I'm not asking how did we ever come up with this concept of chalk. I'm asking, why is it chalk? And so the nominalist, to me, doesn't even seem to answer the question I'm asking, which is a problem, right? If you need your theory to answer the question I'm asking, which is, why is this entity a piece of chalk? And so there are these two different views, just for your knowledge. And so what we're looking at in this class, and what is the mainstream ancient Greek philosophical view, Plato and Aristotle, is going to be in this first camp, where this is a piece of chalk because it has the nature of chalk, or because it has chalkiness, or the nature of calcium carbonate. Again, I don't care whether we use the word chalk or calcium carbonate or whatever else you want to use. It's not about terms. It's about why this thing is the thing that it is. So let's get into the theory of forms. And what I want to do is identify some strange features of the theory, because these are the things that the theory is well known for, and these are interesting, weird things to ponder on and to figure out whether you think these are true. Because some of these theories are a bit strange, that's why Aristotle thinks that some of these just sound too strange, so he tries to come up with a different way to explain this. Using basically the theory of forms, just the terminology is different, and we're not going to get into Aristotle's theory in this class, because we're going to be spending all our time just trying to get a basic sense of the theory of forms. I actually personally think that theory of forms works better than Aristotle's, even though it does have these strange features. But these strange features, I think, are true, so I don't see a problem with them. Okay, so what are some strange features of the forms? Remember, the forms are these common properties or characteristics things have. So a form is one, individual objects are many. This one's not very strange, actually. But if we think about what does this mean, for example, there's one largeness. Right? So largeness is sort of one common characteristic that things could possess. One form. What it is to be large, which is a more wordy way of saying what a form is like what it is to be large, is to exceed something else in size. That's what the form largeness, that's a way of defining the form largeness, is to exceed something else in size or in quantity. And so that is one, right? That characteristic is one. We can give one definition of it, where individual things, meaning like me, you, chairs, tables, trees, right? All the things we perceive, those are always many. Right? There are many large things. In fact, literally everything is large from some perspective, or everything that we can perceive at least. Everything that takes up space is large in relation to certain other things. Right? So there's many large things, but there's really only one largeness. And so that's why oftentimes this is considered part of this issue of the problem of the one and the many, right? What we're talking about here is we're trying to say there's one form, one common characteristics that many, and really an infinite number of things, share, in this case of largeness at least. But the form or the characteristic or nature of large things is one. Okay, so maybe this feature isn't that strange. It's a little strange because it's like how, everything around us we perceive as always many, but then the forms have this characteristic of being one, like one and unique. And that's just strange, right? Nothing we perceive around us has the characteristic of being one in that sense. Here's where it gets a little more perhaps strange sounding. So this why aren't the forms physical things? Because they're not what we would call a physical thing. And so one way to think about this, the form does not exist in space. Any form doesn't exist in space. It's aspatial. Why is it? What it is to be chalk, or the form chalk, is not in any particular place. Now, in a sense, you could say that the nature or form of chalk is in every piece of chalk, and in fact, it's in every calcium carbonate molecule. But it's weird because it's not really in any particular place as one thing. So if the form's going to be one, it's not any more in this piece of chalk than in that piece of chalk. And really, given that we can talk about the form chalk without even having, we're talking about chalk now. I don't have a piece of chalk with me here in this room where I'm doing this video, right? I can talk about it and think about it regardless of wherever, this form, instances of this form happen to be. So the form itself is not in space. Instances of it are in space, right? There are many pieces of chalk. And in a classroom, there's going to be many pieces of chalk. And in fact, every calcium carbonate molecule that we know of exists somewhere in the universe. Calcium carbonate molecules on my finger, at least if I've recently touched chalk. So the individual instances, the individual examples or things that have the nature of chalk, those can be in space. They're always located in space. In fact, they're always going to be somewhere. But chalkness, the form chalk, the nature of chalk, or what it is to be chalk, that's never anywhere. Right? It's not like, over there in the corner, there's the nature of chalk over there in the corner. There's what it is to be chalk. It's sitting over there, in the corner right now. No, that just doesn't work that way. There might be an instance of chalk over there in the corner, but that nature or form itself is not there, kind of in its completeness. Another way that the forms aren't physical things, and again, this might sound kind of strange, but when you think about it, this seems like it has to be true. A form does not exist in any particular time, and in that sense, it's atemporal. So let me give you the example here of the form Tyrannosaurus rex. Okay, so what it is to be the sort of animal that we call a Tyrannosaurus rex, which would just be the form that we would call Tyrannosaurus rex, right? The form Tyrannosaurus rex does not come to be true at one time and cease to be true at another. So what it is to be a Tyrannosaurus rex never started to be true and hasn't ceased to be true, even though every individual Tyrannosaurus rex exists in time and comes to be and passes away in time. So individual sensible objects, like Tyrannosaurus rexes, they exist during some period of time and don't exist at other periods of time. The Tyrannosaurus rexes did exist in the past but are now extinct, right? They no longer exist. But what it is to be a Tyrannosaurus rex, that still is now, right? And still exists now just as much as it ever existed. Which is why we can still do science about it, right? We can know what it is, even though we don't have any living Tyrannosaurus rexes, we can still understand what it is to be a Tyrannosaurus rex. Using the skeletal evidence we have, we can start to understand, here's what a Tyrannosaurus rex was. And here's what a Tyrannosaurus rex is, because this is what a Tyrannosaurus rex is. And this is how we know they don't exist in the world anymore, because we no longer find any things in the world that have the nature of Tyrannosaurus rex. But that nature of Tyrannosaurus rex itself, it still has to be there as something we can think about and talk about and say true things about. Right? Or else we couldn't say true things about it if it wasn't there, right? If it didn't exist as a form, as something we can think about and talk about. Otherwise, how can I talk about it if it's not there existing as a form? So that's the sense in which forms are atemporal. And really, even before Tyrannosaurus rexes came into existence or evolved or were created, right, however you want to think about that, before Tyrannosaurus rex came into being, what a Tyrannosaurus rex was always was there. Even if we wouldn't have even been able to identify it if we hadn't, seen one, it was always there as something that was possible, right? It was always possible that Tyrannosaurus rexes could come into existence. And that means the form Tyrannosaurus rex, what a Tyrannosaurus rex is, what it is to be an animal, Tyrannosaurus rex, what it is to be that kind of animal, always existed as a kind of animal that could come into existence at some point in the history of some universe. And so that's the sense in which the forms are atemporal. They're not in time. They don't exist at particular times and then stop existing. They're eternal, right? They always are. So those are kind of some strange features of the forms. Again, this is just trying to introduce you to them. And let me just end by just laying out maybe perhaps the simplest way to understand what a form is. A form, what is it? It's an objective idea or truth. It's not an idea created by the human mind, but it is kind of like an idea. It's a truth or a whole set of truths. What it is to be a Tyrannosaurus rex, or what it is to be large, or what it is to be a square, right? It's those, I just named there sort of three sets of truth, or three sets of truths. If these are all weird ways of talking, but yeah, that idea of what a Tyrannosaurus rex is, or what large is. And again, it's an idea, but it's an objective one, not one created by the human mind. And again, you can reject that, right? You can reject this and say maybe the human mind creates these, but then you're in a weird position because let's say a form like the form of rock. Did rocks exist in the universe before human beings were there? And if we all went extinct, would rocks stop existing? I would say no, but if they don't stop existing, that means what it is to be a rock doesn't stop existing, right? It's still real, right? What it is to be a rock is real, whether or not I'm there to think about it, or you are, or any human beings are there to think about it, because it's not a concept. It's just what it is to be a rock, right? It's an actual truth, an actual objective idea, if you want to call it that. Another way to sort of get your mind around what Plato's trying to get at with the theory of forms of whenever we understand something that's always true, for example, 1 + 1 is 2, we're understanding forms. If you're understanding something that's always true, like 1 + 1 is 2, or this is what a Tyrannosaurus rex is, and we actually got that right, it's true, it's always going to be true, then you're understanding form, or a combination of forms. And then also another way to think about it is forms are realities that are not in space and time. They're not in space and time. They're not objects that are in space and time and that we're going to perceive in the world around us. They're rather objects that we're going to understand when we understand things and when we think about things. Right, and forms, they're not realities in space and time. Rather, a form prescribes what is possible and desirable for beings that we perceive in space and time.